people might well say, well, as far as I'm concerned, as long as my brain's doing the things I wanted to do, I don't care where it's doing it or what shape it has. But there are, I believe, profound philosophical consequences to the fact that the brain is divided in two. And in medical school, there were a couple of things they were glossed over. I mean, they're obviously true. One is that the brain is divided in two down the middle. And for people who haven't seen a human brain, it's slightly like a large walnut with a sort of wrinkly masses, but a bit in the middle that divides it. And this is not something peculiar to humans. It's true of animals. It's true of birds. It's true of virtually all the creatures that we've looked at that have a kind of proto-brain. The second thing that was odd and was mentioned but just glossed over in medical school was that the brain is asymmetrical. And that too is interesting because there's no real reason for the brain, again, to be asymmetrical. The skull is, broadly speaking, symmetrical. And if you wanted to just get a bit more stuff into the skull, you could expand the brain symmetrically. But indeed, it has expanded asymmetrically, suggesting that there's a difference between what's going on in one part and what's going on in another. And in school, medical school, they mentioned that that was largely due to the thing that was said to set humanity apart, which was the acquisition of language, and that there were language areas in the posterior left hemisphere. And because language was a big thing, it needed a lot of space. And so that part of the brain became bigger. But this can't be true for a couple of important reasons. Animals that don't have language, the monkeys and even the great apes, already have this enlarged area without any big vocabulary to take up that space. And the other thing is that, it wasn't ever mentioned because it was rather embarrassing, was that the largest asymmetry in the brain was actually in favor of the right hemisphere at the front. So the frontal part of the right hemisphere is bigger than the if you like, the same area on the left. Why was that? The third thing was actually mentioned, and it really went home to me, which is that a lot of the communication across the corpus callosum is negative in the sense that it's saying, keep out of it, I'm dealing with it. So one hemisphere will take hold of a task, as it were, and it will send messages to the other hemisphere, which are largely inhibitory. Some of them, of course, are excitatory, but their overall function, more often than not, is to exclude the other hemisphere from getting involved at the moment with this task. Now, that seemed extraordinary. I later discovered that there was no such band of fibers. We call it the corpus callosum in humans. There was no corpus callosum until mammals. So other creatures, reptiles, amphibians, birds, whatever, however sophisticated, didn't have a corpus callosum. And so their two halves of the brain were much more independent. And then when we started to develop one in mammals, very quickly the growth in the size of the brain was not replicated in the size of the corpus callosum. So as the brain got bigger, the corpus callosum got effectively smaller. So it's smaller again in humans. What is all this about? And it seemed to me that at the least what one can say, it was about both uniting two things and dividing two things, keeping them together but keeping them separate because they were distinct. Why and what was that about? And the old story was, and I would ask everybody who doesn't know my work just to put out of their mind everything they think they know about the differences between the hemispheres, because largely it was all nonsense. And it used to be said, for example, that the left hemisphere was rational and dependable, a little bit boring, but there it was. It was, sensible and mature, whereas the right hemisphere was sort of airy-fairy and given to painting pictures. But this is a very bad picture of what's going on. In fact, both hemispheres are involved in doing everything. And that led some people to say, well, there's no question here to answer. But it led me to think, no, there is. There just needs to be a better question than what are they doing? And that question was, in what way are they doing it? And I don't mean by which mechanism. I mean, in what manner, as you would say, of a person, but how does he approach this? What is he like when he's doing whatever he's doing? So the answers there are really fascinating, because perhaps I should just mention that the left hemisphere is not reliable and dependable. It is actually given to delusions, far more delusional than the right hemisphere. Indeed, I'm by far not the only neurologist who said the left hemisphere is delusional when left to its own devices. Secondly, it is not devoid of emotion. It has rather strong emotions, most of them self-regarding ones. It gets very angry very quickly. Anger lateralizes to the left hemisphere more than to the right. And it gets quickly expresses disgust and contempt. In fact, it's a rather disagreeable creature that is not by any means free from its own emotions. The right hemisphere is far more a good guide to reality. We'll come on to that. So just to say, all of that stuff that used to be said is wrong. Why there are two hemispheres is because, at least this is the best explanation I can find, and nobody's produced a better one, and nobody's said that I must be wrong, is that all creatures have to solve a fundamental problem of survival, which is how to get stuff in order to eat or to make a shelter or whatever, and utilize it. So to manipulate the environment, to get stuff to eat, to gather stuff to make tools, to use the world. But if that's all it's doing, it will miss everything else that's going on at the same time. So while it's getting its lunch, it's somebody else's. It's not looking out for its kin. It's not looking out for its mate. It's not looking out for everything else that it should be looking out for. And so the solution, the only solution, has to be, must be, and has been historically, to have two loci or loci of consciousness, one in one of the cerebral hemispheres and one in the other, and addressed to the world in different ways. So their disposition towards the world is different. Their attention to the world is different. This is the root of the distinction. So the left hemisphere's root of attention is to a tiny thing that is isolated, already known, desired, and is easily graspable as long as you focus on it alone and go for it. Whereas the right hemisphere's attention is exactly the opposite. It's not narrow but broad. It's not moving from here to place but sustained. It's vigilant. It's open for everything else without preconception of what it might be. Now, these two complement one another. They work well together. They have completely different modes of approach, but we need those two to be able to survive. And this was imaged in the title I chose for my first book on this topic, The Master and His Emissary. And the idea there is that there is a wise spiritual master who looks after a community so well that it flourishes. And after a while, he realizes that he can't look after all the needs of the community. But what's more, he realizes something even more important, that he mustn't get involved with certain particular detailed matters, because they will draw him away from his broad, intelligent, wise oversight. So he appoints his brightest and best second in command, a sort of aspiring bureaucrat, to go about on his behalf and do the number crunching and the administration and all that, while he is able to maintain the oversight. And there's a well-known principle in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which means that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, and the less you know, the more you think you know it all. Mm-hmm. The left hemisphere is an example of the one that knows rather little but thinks it knows it all, whereas the right hemisphere knows so much that it's more aware of what it can't know. My way of expressing what I think is happening at the present moment in the 21st century, where the hemisphere, the left hemisphere, that knows and sees much less, thinks it knows everything, and is telling us what the answers to things are, while we're not listening to the right hemisphere, who knows a great deal more about how things are. So the right hemisphere attends better to the world, attends to more. It perceives better than the left hemisphere in all modalities, and perceives more. It makes better judgments on the basis of what it has attended to and perceived. And it also has a greater intelligence to bring on bear on understanding that information. So it's emotional and social intelligence, that of the right hemisphere, is greater than that of the left. And the cognitive intelligence of the right hemisphere, IQ, is far more dependent on the right hemisphere than on the left. And indeed, in terms of creativity, the right hemisphere is better at being able to see how something would fit with something else. So it can make sense of the world better than the left hemisphere can do. Generally, everyone would probably agree that we do need science, that we do need reason, that we do also need intuition, and that we do also need imagination. Now, those last two have had a bit of a bad rap in the last 40, 50 years from cognitive psychologists who are sort of trained to think that only rationalistic observations can work. But in fact, we know a great deal, thanks to their efforts, apart from anything else, about the great importance of intuition in coming to deeper understandings of things. Following a rational course can only go along one linear track at a time, but intuition is able to draw on perhaps up to 15 different things that it's aware of, that it knows unconsciously, and bring them to bear on making a final decision. And imagination is, I would argue, essential to getting to understand thoroughly anything else. It's not like fantasy, a way of covering it up and making it untruthful and more fun. Imagination is the deep faculty within us which is true to what is true and wishes to see into it. As you know, I effectively look at the history of the West from the ancient Greeks through to postmodernism, looking at the main shifts in the history of ideas, and show that there are oscillations, periods when the two hemispheres are working in a kind of harmony. That doesn't mean they're of equal value. It means that the left hemisphere is acting as the proper servant or emissary of the right hemisphere. And when it does, we have wonderful periods of flourishing, as we did in the 6th century BC in Athens, as we did again around the year dot in Rome, and as we did at the beginning of the Renaissance in Western Europe. And in those periods, you can see everything taking a step forward, a highly imaginative, creative society that was evolving new systems of thought, making steps forward in science, in astronomy, in map making, but also in drama, in poetry, in music, in painting, in architecture. All these things were flourishing. And then inevitably they become more crude, more gross, more vulgar, and eventually collapse. And they get, as they do so, they drift more and more into the left hemisphere's mode of being. And I believe we're in that stretch. We have been for arguably a few hundred years, but certainly since the Enlightenment, really, in a period when, although the Enlightenment was a marvelous movement, and if I'd been there at the time, I'd have been a great supporter of it. I think it's also a hubristic movement that overestimated what it could do and what its importance was. And we're reaping the benefits now. They are that we believe we can find all the answers to everything by simply doing more experiments, roughly speaking. And you can imagine that what this results is two kinds of a world. One is like the real, living, unpredictable world that you actually encounter from second to second. And the other is like a reproduction, like a map or a film or whatever, where everything is already in place and is just a representation of what was originally a living thing and present. So the left hemisphere's world is this non-world, and the right hemisphere's world is this vivid living world. And what I think has happened in our time is that we have come so much to believe in our helpful map, the schema, the diagram that enabled us to exploit, that we think that's all that there is. And it's like somebody who tries to live in the map instead of living in the world that is mapped. And so about all the things the left hemisphere would want you not to do, the number one thing is to slow down. Everything in our life now tells us to speed up, to try and do things faster and faster and faster. And in doing so, you can't really appreciate anything because it takes time. We're guided by these fantasies of total control, of being able to achieve so much. Just wait, in 10 years' time, we've mucked everything up, but you wait, we'll have even more power to muck it up in 10 years' time. We don't need more power over the world because we're exerting that power in damaging ways. What we need is greater wisdom, and wisdom begins in humility, which is the awareness of just how little you do really understand. And you can't certainly appreciate the subtle unspoken, the intuitional, and the in between the lines sort of elements in life, which need to be savored and to take pleasure in the moment, which actually is something we need to practice. It doesn't come naturally to us anymore because we've been subjected to a culture which focuses on us on surfaces, on the superficial, on the maps, on the diagrams, on the boxes we need to tick. Anything to get us not to be looking at the actual world, which is still amazingly unfolding in front of us, and to recapture the awe of that. I think once you recapture and feel again the awe-inspiring nature of existence, then you're getting close to living again.